At the dawn of the 20th century, the Middle East was not a collection of modern nation-states, but the beating heart of a vast, aging imperial system. For nearly 400 years, the Ottoman Empire had ruled these lands, stretching from Anatolia through the Levant and deep into Arabia. Its borders were not lines on a map but living frontiers shaped by trade, faith, and local authority. Yet by 1914, this empire was weakening, pressured by internal decay and the rising ambitions of Europe's great powers. Britain and France did not enter the Middle East as neutral observers. They arrived as imperial rivals with long histories in the region. Britain's primary concern was strategic, protecting the route to India and securing the Suez Canal, the lifeline of its empire. France, meanwhile, saw itself as the historic patron of Christians in the Levant and sought cultural and political influence in Syria and Lebanon. Long before the First World War, both powers viewed Ottoman lands not as sovereign territories, but as future prizes. When the First World War erupted, the Ottomans made a fateful decision. Aligning with Germany and the Central Powers, they transformed their empire into a battlefield. This choice opened the Middle East to direct European military intervention. For Britain and France, war created opportunity, an unprecedented chance to reshape the region according to imperial interests, yet conquering territory was only half the challenge. The greater task was legitimacy. Britain, in particular, understood that defeating the Ottomans would require local allies. Arab populations across the empire were discontented, frustrated by heavy taxation, conscription, and the centralization policies of Istanbul. Sensing an opening, British officials began secret correspondence with Arab leaders, offering support for independence in exchange for rebellion. At the center of these negotiations was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, guardian of Islam's holiest cities and a powerful figure in the Arab world. Through a series of letters exchanged with British officials in Cairo, Hussein was led to believe that Britain would recognize and support an independent Arab kingdom after the war. The promise was deliberately vague, but it was enough. In 1916, the Arab Revolt began. Arab fighters, supported by British officers and resources, rose against Ottoman rule. Railways were sabotaged, garrisons attacked, and the empire's grip on Arabia weakened. To many Arab leaders, this revolt was not merely a military alliance, it was the birth of a new political future. They believed they were fighting for self-determination, but even as Britain made promises to Arab allies, it was engaged in another, far more secret negotiation, this time with France. In 1916, behind closed doors in Europe, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French envoy François-Georges Picot drafted an agreement that would become one of the most consequential documents in modern Middle Eastern history. Known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it outlined how Britain and France intended to divide Ottoman Arab territories after the war. The agreement carved the region into zones of control and influence. France would dominate the northern Levant, modern-day Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would control Mesopotamia and secure influence over Palestine and Transjordan. These borders were not drawn with local realities in mind. They ignored tribal boundaries, religious communities, and historical connections. Instead, they reflected imperial convenience and strategic calculation. Crucially, the agreement directly contradicted the promises Britain had made to Arab leaders. Independence was replaced with mandates. Self-rule was postponed indefinitely. Yet this contradiction remained hidden from Arab allies, buried in diplomatic secrecy. As the war dragged on, the human cost mounted. Cities were shelled, famine spread across Greater Syria, and entire communities were displaced. The Ottoman collapse was no longer theoretical, it was unfolding in real time. By 1918, Allied forces had defeated Ottoman armies across the region. The empire that had governed the Middle East for centuries lay in ruins. When the war ended, Arab leaders expected their reward, freedom. What they received instead was a political shock. The secret agreements were exposed, first by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution, and later through Allied actions on the ground. French troops marched into Damascus. British administrators took control of Baghdad and Jerusalem. Independence was replaced by mandates, a new imperial language for old colonial rule. The division of the Middle East was no accident, nor was it inevitable. It was the product of wartime urgency, imperial ambition, and deliberate deception. Borders were drawn before nations existed. Promises were made to be broken. And the consequences of those decisions would echo for generations. This is where our story truly begins, not with ancient hatreds or timeless conflicts, but with modern choices made in European offices, far from the deserts and cities they would transform forever. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent, the peoples of the Middle East expected a new era to begin. Ottoman rule had collapsed, and the language of the age was self-determination. Across the Arab world, leaders believed the sacrifices of war would be rewarded with independence. Instead, they were introduced to a new imperial system, one that spoke of guidance and development, but functioned as colonial controlled. In 1920, the victorious powers gathered at the San Remo Conference to decide the fate of former Ottoman territories. There, Britain and France formalized their plans under the authority of the newly created League of Nations. The result was the Mandate System, a legal framework that claimed certain peoples were not yet ready for self-rule and required European supervision. In theory, mandates were temporary. In practice, they were empire by another name. France received control over Syria and Lebanon. Britain secured Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Transjordan. These were not natural nations formed by shared political will, but administrative units carved to suit imperial interests. Borders were finalized in conference rooms, not local councils. Communities that had lived together for centuries were split apart, while rival groups were forced into the same political containers. Nowhere was this more evident than in Iraq. Britain merged 3 former Ottoman provinces, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, into a single state. Each region had distinct religious, ethnic, and tribal identities. Shiite Arabs in the south, Sunni Arabs in the center, and Kurds in the north found themselves bound together under a monarchy chosen not by them, but by London. To legitimize its rule, Britain installed Faisal I of Iraq, a Hashemite prince who had fought alongside the British during the Arab Revolt. Though Faisal spoke of unity and independence, real power remained with British advisors, military officers, and oil interests. When Iraqis rebelled in 1920, Britain responded with overwhelming force, including aerial bombardment, one of the first uses of air power to control civilian populations. In the Levant, French rule was even more direct. French authorities divided their mandate into multiple statelets: Damascus, Aleppo, Alawite territories, and Greater Lebanon, deliberately fragmenting Arab nationalism. Lebanon was expanded to include diverse religious communities, creating a fragile sectarian balance that would shape its future instability. Syrians resisted from the beginning. Nationalists declared an independent kingdom in Damascus under Faisal, but French forces crushed it in 1920 at the Battle of Massillon. The dream of a united, independent Syria was buried beneath military occupation and administrative decree. While Iraq and Syria struggled under mandates, Palestine became the most explosive legacy of imperial contradiction. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, pledging support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, without consulting its Arab majority. This promise directly conflicted with earlier assurances of Arab independence. As British rule took hold, Jewish immigration increased, driven by European anti-Semitism and Zionist aspirations. Arab Palestinians, fearing dispossession, resisted politically and violently. Britain attempted to balance incompatible commitments, pleasing neither side. Tensions escalated into riots, revolts, and deepening mistrust that would define the region for decades. Transjordan, east of the Jordan River, was carved out as a separate entity under British supervision and placed under Faisal's brother, Abdullah I of Jordan. It was a buffer state, strategically useful, lightly populated, and politically dependent. Independence, when it came, was carefully managed and limited. Across the region, mandates created states without shared national identity but with centralized power structures designed to maintain order, not representation. European legal codes replaced local systems. Foreign languages dominated administration. Economic policies prioritized imperial trade and resource extraction, especially oil. By the 1930s, resistance movements grew stronger. Strikes, protests, and uprisings spread from Palestine to Syria to Iraq. Britain and France responded with repression, censorship, and military force, revealing the true nature of the mandate system. These territories were not being prepared for freedom, they were being controlled. When independence finally arrived after the Second World War, it came too late and on fragile foundations. Borders had hardened. Elites had been shaped by colonial governance. Armies and security services were empowered over civil institutions. The new states inherited unresolved divisions and unresolved promises. The Middle East that emerged was not ancient, nor accidental. It was modern and deliberately constructed. The mandate system did not simply divide territory, it shaped political culture, normalized authoritarianism, and embedded external influence deep into regional affairs. Understanding today's conflicts requires returning to this moment, when independence was deferred, borders were imposed, and the future was negotiated without the consent of those who would live with the consequences. By the late 1940s, formal European empires in the Middle East were retreating, but true independence was far from complete. Britain and France were leaving behind states shaped by colonial rule, fragile political systems, artificial borders, and militarized governments. Into this unstable environment stepped two new forces: local armies trained under imperial systems, and the global rivalry of the Cold War. The end of the Second World War marked a shift, not a solution. The old colonial powers were weakened, but their influence lingered through treaties, military bases, and economic control. At the same time, the United States and the Soviet Union began competing for influence across the newly independent world. The Middle East, rich in oil and strategically positioned, became a central arena in this global struggle. In many Arab states, parliamentary systems introduced under the mandates quickly faltered. These institutions had little popular legitimacy and were often associated with elites who had cooperated with colonial rulers. Meanwhile, armies, modern, organized, and armed, emerged as the most powerful institutions in society. It was only a matter of time before they entered politics. The first major rupture came in Egypt. In 1952, a group of military officers overthrew the monarchy, ending decades of British dominance. From this movement emerged Gamal Abdel Nasser, a charismatic leader who would reshape the Arab world. Nasser spoke the language of anti-imperialism, Arab unity, and social justice. For millions, he represented a long-delayed answer to the betrayals of the Mandate era. Nasser's vision directly challenged lingering European control, especially in Egypt's most strategic asset, the Suez Canal. In 1956, when Nasser nationalized the canal, Britain and France, alongside Israel, launched a military intervention to regain control. The Suez Crisis marked a turning point. Though militarily successful at first, Britain and France were forced to withdraw under international pressure. Their era as dominant Middle Eastern powers was over, yet the vacuum they left behind did not lead to stability. Across the region, military coups followed one another in rapid succession. Iraq's monarchy collapsed in 1958. Syria experienced repeated coups, reflecting deep divisions inherited from the Mandate period. In each case, the military justified its takeover as a necessary correction to weak civilian rule, a weakness rooted in colonial design. The Cold War intensified these internal struggles. The United States supported conservative monarchies and military regimes that promised stability and protected Western interests. The Soviet Union backed revolutionary movements and authoritarian republics that opposed Western influence. Ideology mattered less than alignment. Democracy was rarely the priority. Oil transformed the stakes. Resources discovered under Mandate-era agreements now fueled global economies. Control over oil fields and pipelines shaped alliances, interventions, and internal repression. Governments that aligned with powerful patrons received weapons and funding, strengthening security services at the expense of political participation. One of the most enduring consequences of imperial division exploded in Palestine. In 1948, the creation of Israel, and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, ignited a conflict that would become central to regional politics. Arab states, themselves products of artificial borders and fragile legitimacy, were drawn into repeated wars they were ill-prepared to fight. Defeat in these wars further empowered military rulers, who used external threats to justify emergency laws and suppress dissent. The promise of unity and liberation slowly hardened into authoritarianism. The language of anti-imperialism remained, but the structures of power increasingly resembled those left behind by empire. By the 1970s, the region was locked into a cycle shaped by its colonial inheritance, centralized states, weak civil society, powerful militaries, and borders that encouraged conflict rather than cooperation. Western powers still intervened, sometimes directly, sometimes through proxies, but always within a framework built decades earlier by Britain and France. Even when oil wealth brought modernization, it did not resolve the deeper contradictions. Development occurred without political inclusion. Education expanded, but political expression narrowed. The state grew stronger, while the social contract remained fragile. The Cold War ended, but its impact did not. Regimes born from post-mandate coups remained in power. Conflicts frozen by superpower rivalry reemerged. The lines drawn after the First World War continued to define who ruled, who resisted, and who suffered. What Britain and France created was not just a map, it was a system where borders preceded nations, where power flowed from the top down, and where external interests shaped internal politics. The crises of the late 20th century, and those that followed, cannot be understood without recognizing this legacy. The Middle East's modern struggles are not the result of timeless divisions. They are the outcome of modern history, of imperial decisions, Cold War calculations, and the long shadow of mandates that ended in name, but not in consequence. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Middle East stood at a crossroads. The Cold War had ended, but the structures it reinforced, authoritarian governments, militarized states, and rigid borders, remained firmly in place. The promises of independence made after the First World War had long faded, replaced by regimes that ruled through force rather than consent. Beneath the surface, pressure was building. The borders drawn by Britain and France after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire had survived wars, revolutions, and ideological shifts. They were defended fiercely by states that feared fragmentation, even as those same borders failed to reflect social and political realities. In many countries, national identity was imposed from above, while local, sectarian, and tribal identities continued to shape daily life. By the early 2000s, the region was marked by deep contradictions. Oil wealth had transformed skylines and economies, yet unemployment and inequality remained widespread. Education expanded, but political participation stayed limited. Governments spoke the language of stability, but delivered stagnation. These tensions were not new, they were the legacy of a system designed for control, not accountability. The US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 exposed just how fragile the post-mandate order truly was. The removal of Saddam Hussein's regime dismantled the centralized authority that had held together a deeply divided state, one originally assembled under British rule. Without strong institutions or inclusive politics, Iraq fractured along sectarian and ethnic lines that had been suppressed, not resolved. Since the Mandate era, what followed was not simply chaos, but the unraveling of an inherited structure. Militias replaced state authority. Borders became porous. Regional powers intervened. The artificial unity imposed in the 1920s collapsed under modern pressures, revealing unresolved questions about identity, power, and belonging. These same fault lines surfaced dramatically in 2011, when protests erupted across the Arab world. From Tunisia to Egypt, Syria to Yemen, millions demanded dignity, justice, and an end to authoritarian rule. The Arab Spring was not a sudden awakening, it was the delayed response to a century of broken promises. In Egypt, mass protests brought down a long-standing regime, but the military, an institution empowered since the post-colonial era, soon reasserted control. In Syria, peaceful demonstrations were met with brutal repression, spiraling into a devastating civil war. The state boundaries drawn by France endured, but the social contract within them collapsed. Syria's conflict illustrated the darkest consequences of the Mandate legacy. The French had governed through division, empowering minorities and weakening shared national identity. Decades later, when central authority cracked, those divisions turned violent. External powers once again intervened, echoing the patterns of the past. Local conflicts shaped by global interests. Elsewhere, borders created by imperial design proved equally brittle. Libya, a state formed through colonial compromise, disintegrated after the fall of its regime. Yemen, long divided and reassembled under foreign influence, descended into prolonged war. In each case, the state existed on maps, but struggled to function as a political community. The Palestinian question remained unresolved, perhaps the most enduring symbol of imperial contradiction. The Mandate-era decisions that ignored local consent continued to generate cycles of violence, displacement, and diplomatic failure. Every escalation served as a reminder that unfinished colonial business still defined regional politics. What united these crises was not religion or culture alone, but governance. States inherited from Britain and France were designed to be strong at the center and weak in representation. When challenged, they responded with force. When they fell, there were few institutions capable of managing transition peacefully. For many in the Middle East, the modern era has been shaped by forces beyond their control, first imperial, then Cold War, then globalized. Yet the root remains the same: political systems imposed without consent tend to collapse without legitimacy. Today, new generations question the borders and narratives they inherited. Social media connects communities once isolated. History is being revisited, not as distant memory, but as lived reality. The lines drawn a century ago still decide who governs, who resists, and who flees. Britain and France did not intend to create endless conflict. Their goal was stability on imperial terms. But by prioritizing control over consent, strategy over society, they embedded instability into the foundations of the modern Middle East. Understanding this does not absolve modern leaders of responsibility. Nor does it deny local agency. But it does challenge the myth that today's crises are ancient or inevitable. They are modern, historical, and traceable. The Middle East was not broken by history, it was shaped by it. And until that history is fully understood, its consequences will continue to unfold.